Mike Pettine has thrown his hat in the ring for Vikings defensive coordinator. We'll talk about what all of that means here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You like that on 3, 1, 2, 3, you like it!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome into the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. Show is on Twitter at Locked On Vikings, and thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. You can also find the show on Amazon Fire or Roku. Just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app for all of the things in the Minnesota world of the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. It's daily fantasy made easy. Just pick 2 to 5 of your favorite players and whether or not they'll score more or less than their PrizePicks projection. You can get up to 10 times your money on entry. First-time users get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. Obviously, the big news of the day is that Mike Pettine interviewed for a defensive coordinator. You're watching this on Thursday. This is when Brian Flores is also scheduled to interview, and those are the 4 that we know of. So unless they add anybody else last minute, that's probably who we're picking from. And go listen to Monday's episode for my thoughts on Brian Flores, but short version, I'm a fan. I'm a bigger fan of Sean Desai even, and Ryan Nielsen I don't really get. This one I like less than all 3 of those. This is by far my least favorite option. And by the end of the show, you'll hopefully understand why I feel that way. But when we come across this, where like the team is doing something we don't like, right? I always feel like it's important to give it a fair shake. So let's really think through it. And if it really is as bad of an idea as we're assuming that it is, then thinking through it will only kind of embolden us in that take, right? Give us a better kind of foundation on which to talk about. But first, there's a question I've gotten a whole bunch of times today, so I'll answer that, which is this just a courtesy thing? And I would be very surprised to learn that it was just a courtesy interview. Mike Pettine has been a mentor to Kevin O'Connell for many years. O'Connell's talked about that since they were on the Jets together. And Kevin O'Connell was a backup quarterback for the Jets, and Mike Pettine was there. I believe that was the Hard Knocks year, if I'm not mistaken. So they've known each other for a long time, and that's why Pettine got brought in, not necessarily to run the defense, but to sort of be an experienced voice, somebody who's been a head coach before, who's failed at head coach before, and can hopefully impart the lessons he's learned from that. And also as a 3-4 zone match guy that he's been for his whole career. And I think a lot of people look at that and they say, well, maybe he's just doing his friend a favor by giving him an interview. And I don't think that is necessarily logical. For one, if it is like a courtesy, if it's a professionalism move, that's kind of a patronizing move. I don't know. If it were me, I wouldn't want to be called in to interview for a job that I don't have a chance of actually getting. I wouldn't take that as a sign of respect. I would actually kind of take it the opposite way. And that has happened to me. And it doesn't feel good. But that's just me personally. I don't know what his feelings are on that. But also, Mike Pettine is, I think, associate head coach or assistant head coach. Like, he has a very high position on the staff, and making him defensive coordinator would add responsibilities, but I don't know if I would necessarily consider it a promotion, but rather sort of a lateral move, if anything. This would be very similar to when Gary Kubiak became offensive coordinator. You had Kevin Stefanski, and Gary Kubiak was kind of, an experienced voice in the room. Stefanski leaves. You just put Kubiak in the role because that's the path of least resistance. But they did that after 2019. The Vikings had a top 10 offense. An offense they were thrilled with. They had just made the playoffs. They even won a playoff game. So they had all the reason in the world to keep continuity. And Kevin Stefanski left to be a head coach. So they just had a role to fill and they didn't want to screw anything up. They actively got rid of a guy. Like, they went to Ed Donatel and fired him, and we are going in a different direction. So I would be very surprised if this is what the move. And I would be fairly upset if this were the move. Because if you were gonna stick with the status quo, stick with the guy that was in the room. And Mike Pettine, I've said a lot when it comes to Donatel, hey, the staff made these problems. It is the staff as a whole. And it's not just Donatel. You can't just look at one guy and say, well, that guy was the cancer, and absolve all of the rest of the people in the room. No, there's a lot of people in team meetings making bad decisions that ended up costing the Vikings their season ultimately. So Mike Pettine has his share of that blame. I mean, he carries his portion of the sins, right? So giving him the job, to me, it would read like, well, look, everybody happy? We got rid of a guy, and that Donatel was just kind of a sacrificial lamb, but that they don't think that there was anything, systemically wrong with the way the defense operated. And I don't think anybody would agree with that. I think that would be pretty naive. Like, that would be the message it sends. But the thing is, I don't think it's a courtesy interview. I don't think it's an honor thing or a respect thing. I do think that they're genuinely considering Mike Pettine for the job. And my first question would have to be, so what changes then between Donatel and Mike Pettine? And part of the reason I wasn't into firing Ed Donatel in the middle of the season was because Mike Pettine takes over. And my perception is that he kind of does the same stuff. He does a lot of soft, a lot of off coverage, a lot of Packers fans hated it when he would drop like Rashawn Gary into coverage. So that, you would get that. And it's like, wait, that's all the stuff we already hate. It's just a different ball dude causing the same problems. What changed? What got fixed? And that would kind of be where my mind goes, is asking kind of what changes here if you bring in Pettine. And that's not to say that there can't be an answer to that question. Maybe Pettine comes in and says, oh yeah, Donatel did not blitz nearly enough. I'll blitz more. Okay, well, we can maybe work with that, right? Or he'll call more, maybe I'll call more press this time. I learned my lesson in Green Bay or whatever. And that's what you ask in the interview. Having a guy who's been a defensive coordinator for so long in your building and not giving him a shot would maybe seem like a naive move. I don't think it would be a particularly disrespectful move to Pettine. Ask him, hey, are you interested in this job? And if he says yes, sure, interview him, like kind of whatever, no harm in an interview. But I don't want to downplay the odds of this actually being the way that they go, or they go, we'll just keep continuity. And that's the pitch, right? I went over all of the different pitches for what the other defensive coordinators would represent, kind of what the take is. Where, for example, hiring Brian Flores, the take is moving to zone match didn't work. We're going to go back to the old ways. We're going to go back to the old system, and we're going to, and if there are growing pains for the young guys or whatever, we're going to cover that up with a whole bunch of blitzes, and Brian Flores is a good blitz designer. That's the idea. And when Ryan Nielsen, the idea is, well, we just don't think the leadership was there on defense, and Ryan Nielsen's a leadership guy. So we're going to bring him in, and it's going to be a culture. We're going to fix it with culture like we fixed the offense with culture. And that would be the pitch that they're trying to sell to you. The pitch with Pettine is, we don't think this problem is systemic. We think it was localized to Ed Donatel specifically. And we think in a second year in this scheme, things are going to turn up a lot. And so we don't want to change that much. And I think my biggest problem with that is that all of those positives are also represented by Sean Desai, who has a much more versatile background and is known for playing more press, which the Vikings need. It just feels like he addresses that particular concern, the one that I've been preaching, which is, these guys struggled in their first year, but I think we can project a year two leap just kind of because that's how it goes. And if you're going to go with that and say, let's give these guys a year two, I struggle to see what Mike Pettine offers that Sean Desai doesn't, outside of experience. But experience doesn't count for a lot when you have a lot of experience being bad at the job. And that is my perception of Mike Pettine, at least on an NFL standard, right? He has coached a lot of bad defenses, and I have concerns of that. Now, he's a very well-respected guy in the league, and I'm not exactly going to come out and be like, that guy doesn't know how to coach. That would be insane of me. I don't have that much hubris, but I have concerns over the track record and his results, which I think is more than fair. I want to think about the idea of continuity a little bit more when it comes to defense and what the value of continuity is, and sort of in a cost benefit sense. So we're gonna do that. But before I get into it, if you are looking to gamble on the NFL playoffs, or shoot, NBA or NHL, you can find all of that at FanDuel. It's our new sports betting partner for Locked On, and we're super stoked because they're the number one sports book in America. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have a whole bunch of great features that make betting very easy. They have everything you could ever want for player props and the spreads, odds, lines, all the classic stuff. You can bet on, again, sports wide and all of that, and you can even put together a same game parlay and get real into the game, try to up those winnings. New customers, you can join today to get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. FanDuel has all your favorite bets, from the money line to point spreads to player props. Plus, you can even combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay, all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thanks so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out Locked On NFL, previewing the conference championship games. And hey, go to my Twitter page and watch the Christian Darrisaw cut up. It should be up shortly after this goes up on YouTube. So go to my Twitter page and find it. Is good. It's insane. It's, I think, 57, 58 clips of Darrisaw being violent and dominating people. So if you're interested in that. So can you tell I've been watching a lot of Darrisaw this week? I digress. So with Mike Pettine, he represents a certain amount of continuity on defense, right? And continuity is something of a scary word, right? Especially with the Wilfs. And man, I've gotten DMs and replies and people in mailbags and stuff who really, really, really hate that the Wilfs refuse to be bad, which is hilarious. Try explaining that to a Martian. Oh yeah, this fan of the sports team, they're really mad that the team wants to be good. Like, they really don't want the team to be good. And they don't want the team to try to be good. And they're really upset about it. Like, what? And of course, this is people who want to tank. And I've said my tank thing a million times. So I won't bog you down with it, but people really don't like the idea of continuity. Essentially, the argument goes, hey, that defense was not good, and you're not going to win a Super Bowl with that defense. And I've even heard some people say that the Wilfs aren't interested in winning a Super Bowl, which is asinine. They've very directly told you the opposite, and I think their actions also tell you the opposite, that they are not worried about being stuck in 8-8 forever and losing tickets because of that, because they're that much closer to a Super Bowl. And you can probably hear it kind of in my tone. I don't mind continuity as an abstract concept. I think that there are advantages to it for sure. And to the point where if something is, a D-, keeping it together for a year and doing nothing might make it into a C, right? And that means free improvement just by keeping the band together. There's no cost. You don't have to spend a draft pick on it. You don't have to spend cap space on it unless there's an extension or something. Just by not cutting players, you get players to play better because they have another year together in the same system and blah, blah, blah. That's very efficient. And I like that. That does not mean that I am averse to changing things that aren't working, right? And so we need to go over what isn't working and kind of identify the problem areas and then figure out what they are. And I think with the way the Vikings have approached defensive coordinator so far, I think we get a really clear sense of what they think that is, until they put Mike Pettine in the mix, who kind of represents a rejection of all of that, and goes with, well, let's just go with the in-house guy and not change anything, which is kind of why I don't like the move. I say it's too much continuity. I like continuity, but that's too much. I am normally very much in team, keep things together and keep things going. And I think if you just go through the defensive roster and you ask, will a second year in the system help this guy? It's like universally yes, right? I mean, there are some players who are just kind of beyond hope, right? There's some guys that just like aren't very good, and I just don't think an extra year in the scheme is going to fix it. Most of those players like aren't starting or whatever, right? But if you look at a guy like Lewis Seen, who was making the same transition everybody else on the defense was making from a man match cover 7 scheme. That's what they run at Georgia, is very similar to what we were running with Zimmer. So they were kind of making the same transition as Eric Kendricks, who struggled, and year 2 would be good for him. Danielle Hunter, who kind of was off to a slow start in the beginning of the year and kind of only came on in the back half of the season. Year 2 will be helpful for him. And it would be asinine not to expect the same thing for a rookie who was also, pile on top of that, transitioning to the NFL. And to avoid the perception of being a total bust, he had to do it in the first 4 weeks of the season, which is impossible. I'm sorry, that's insane. If you figured that out, I mean, Kyle Hamilton was bad in the first 4 weeks of the season too. He came on really strong at the end of the year. Who knows what would have happened with Seen if he had stayed healthy. I am concerned, by the way, as an aside, with Seen's injuries. Just because when you're rehabbing, you're not training as like the same way, right? You're focusing your energy on rehab and not on like developing as a player. So the whole thing really goes on pause, and I don't know if you can really think of it as year 2. It's kind of rookie year, the sequel, which is a bummer. Because you would hope he'd come along faster than that. The rookie contract doesn't wait. So all of that being said, you can look at Harrison Smith, Cam Bynum, Kendricks, Hunter, and all these guys and sort of project that a year 2 will help. And so that's sort of the point in favor of continuity. But Pettine, like I said, represents too much continuity. With Desai, he will call a different chapter, but of the same playbook. So you're using the same terminology, the same sort of structure, the same hierarchy, the same types of assignments. So all the stuff that you've been practicing all year is still useful, and you're just putting it in a different order. It's kind of like switching from English to Mandarin Chinese, or from Mandarin to like Cantonese. It's like, oh, we're doing some different stuff here, but once I've learned the characters, it's going to be a lot easier for me to sort of transition from one thing to the other versus I got to figure out what a B is. That's a little harder. And especially because that's not how Chinese works. But the point is, when it comes to zone match and what those roles are, I don't think I've done a good enough job of being specific in kind of what I mean and what Pettine would represent and kind of what stays with him. So I'll try to quick itemize and go over that. But first, I want to talk to you about daily fantasy, but not your classic daily fantasy that you would find where you have to put together a whole lineup and add a whole bunch of people into it. If you only just have a couple players you think will do well, how about PrizePicks instead? With PrizePicks, it's just you versus the house. They have a player projection, and you make an entry with however many of your favorite players, and whether or not they'll do better or worse than their PrizePicks projection. It is that simple. It is that easy, and it's a much better way to play the idea of daily fantasy, where these are my guys today, and let's see how they all do. It's actually 2 to 6 players now, and you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry if you nail it. They have safe and fast withdrawals. They're currently operational in over 30 states and Canada, and entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. Deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit 50, PrizePicks will give you 50, and so on. Don't forget to enter promo code Locked On when you sign up at prizepicks.com or on the PrizePicks app. So I don't feel like I've been substantive enough with you so far today. So let me try to change that. I've been meandering around the point, but the point is there are all these problems, and Mike Pettine kind of represents this expectation that these problems will solve themselves. And again, maybe they will. There's actually a reason to believe that maybe they will solve themselves. But I don't buy it. I get it, but I don't buy it, if that makes sense. Like one of those problems is that the Vikings stayed in soft zone too often. There was a lot made about like off coverage versus press coverage. If you listen to like Mina Kimes talk about the Vikings, that was her. She banged that drum really hard. Um, and a big reason for that is because the Vikings didn't really live in man coverage a lot for the first like 3 quarters of the season. They played in, these cover six kind of quarters sort of structures, and those require the corners to play off. It's in the instruction. There isn't really an option to play press in a lot of those structures. So you play a lot of off coverage and then they kill you for 7 yards a pop. And we didn't have the means to fix that for more complicated reasons that I can point you to a Patreon video that I think is the best job I've done of explaining it. But basically, there were just these holes in those zones and teams found them and the Vikings didn't really have a way to paper them over. Pettine, I don't think represents a change from that. I think you would see a lot more soft zone. And I think that is probably my single biggest problem with this as a hire is not that I think that Pettine is this super incompetent guy. You don't get a career that long in the NFL without doing something a little bit right. I mean, guys get fired all the time in the NFL, even when they're long respected people with a lot of connections and friendships, like Ed Donatel, right? So there is some merit to being able to, be a coach, but the problems that plagued the Vikings come down to something I think that Mike Pettine would do as well. He also runs that same base, that kind of 3-4, but it's more of like a 5-2-4 where you've got the 5 men on the front and then one of Zadarius Smith or Daniil Hunter is backing into coverage in base if you're not sending 5. That is exploitable. So much the Vikings did a great job of exploiting it for 3 years when he was in Green Bay, and put up some of their best games against Green Bay, to be honest, in those years. You would get Preston Smith in coverage, and that would be that. And Joe Barry's doing a lot of the same stuff. Like going from Mike Pettine to Joe Barry for the Packers feels like it would be a really similar move to going from Ed Donatel to Mike Pettine. All these guys kind of come off the same tree and subscribe to the same philosophies. And I don't think you need to be that samey to preserve the sort of momentum and progress that individual players made over the course of the season. Like Daniil Hunter got better over the course of the season. You don't want to erase that, and I get it. But I don't think you would be erasing that if you went with Desai, for example. And even with somebody like Flores, who's a bit of a chameleon schematically, I mean, he has worked in 3-4 structures, and I think he would be able to work with, a team that's sort of half installed zone match, but is still half, their foot is halfway through the door to man match and stuff. Like, I think he would be able to work with those teams, which is why I like those two guys a lot. The other problem is blitzes. Mike Pettine, I don't think he was that blitz heavy. I don't think he was blitz heavy enough in Green Bay. Any hate watching Packers fans that want to hear me talk about this, I don't know. Hit me up. Let me know, because I didn't follow the Packers that closely. But my understanding from afar was that they didn't get enough pressure, and they didn't send enough pressure. When they did, it was interesting and exotic and fun, and you kind of hoped you saw that this year, and that's kind of the other part of this. Like I said, Pettine was on this defensive staff, the defensive staff that failed so badly that they fired the defensive coordinator. Pettine was in all of those rooms. So where were those exotic blitzes this year? When we did call it, a lot of times it came out really vanilla. So where was all that stuff, right? What has Mike Pettine done here other than be a friend and mentor to the head coach to deserve this job? And I don't have a great answer to that question. So I'm pretty vehemently against this idea. But like it was with head coach, if you go listen to me talk about all the head coaches, I made sure to qualify a lot that, of course, I give it a chance, right? If they bring in Mike Pettine, I think people who are in that press conference should ask, hey, why should we expect anything to be any different, right? I think they're tough questions to be asked, and I think the beat should ask them. I don't think they need to hear that from me. But at the end of the day, when week 1 rolls around, all right, show me what you got then. And I've got my hypothesis that I think this won't work, but if they prove me wrong, I'd be more than happy to accept it. I'd rather not be in that world. So we'll see what happens. We will talk tomorrow about whatever. We're kind of still in this whatever world. They'll interview Brian Flores, and then hopefully by next week we know who the defensive coordinator is. It seems like they're pretty much ready to make those distinctions, unless there's somebody like on the Eagles staff or something that they're waiting to interview because they didn't get it in the first round of the playoffs when they when they were still preparing for a game. So yeah, we'll see how it all plays out. We either find out next week or we don't find out for a while, which tells us that they're looking at someone that they just can't talk to yet. But we'll keep an eye on all of it. I will talk to you about whatever tomorrow. And as always, Skol.